at a modern map,
Sir,
the
here's a map.
country of Saudi Arabia is enormous, but there's almost no
Yeah,
arable
that's
land
where I saw
anywhere.
it. One of these.
There's a tiny little strip of arable land along the coast of the Persian
Oh,
Gulf
they
on
keep
the east
coming.
side. The rest of it is just desolate, empty waste. If you looked at the country of Jordan, this lies just to the east of Israel, you know, on the east side of the Jordan River, and Jordan isn't even shown on this map.
You don't have to
But,
like stuff.
Did somebody go?
We're
Modern
missing a
country
table
of
here.
Jordan.
Oh, I didn't see
Yes,
it.
we're missing.
There's
Used to be.
almost no
Yeah.
arable land in the whole country. It's just
You
desert.
all are keeping cool.
And you know who lives in the desert? Almost nobody except nomads. And most of them are Arabs. And originally they were virtually all nomads, and they lived, you know, in tents, and they moved all the time. Usually they move from one oasis to another. And around the oasis, there would be a small area with trees and so on, because the oasis, there was water coming up out of the ground. And they would have to move from one oasis to another oasis. And they would have sheep, goats.
There's something like that here in America too, is there's people that live in some of the major cities, that just move around the ways they live in tents. Am I making that up?
Maybe.
Almost.
What?
Almost.
Oh, well, no, I'm talking about groups of people that actually live there.
Gypsies.
Huh?
Gypsies.
Gypsies, that's the word, yeah. Gypsies.
I don't know about it.
I don't think so, not modern, not anymore.
Not anymore.
They were primarily in Europe. There's yeah.
I think there are too. I've seen their places, you know, they usually near downtown, very cities.
Are there any Egyptians left in
Just 2 minutes,
I went gypsies always.
Yeah, we did that.
I knocked on your door yesterday and nobody answered. I didn't know where you were, maybe you were with your sister or something. After that, after we played.
It's 20 now.
Okay.
It was 12, just at 3 minutes. So there's some people that like to come in really late, you know.
I'm here.
You're tardy, sir. You're gonna have to report to the principal after this. See, we didn't even leave a seat for you.
Okay. Okay. There you go.
He's gonna find a seat right here and by the time he gets to the steps. If he finally gets seated, so that we can get started, I can, from where he's gonna sit, I can throw an eraser at him. When he starts to fall asleep.
Usually has this, this kind of case. There's something back there.
Okay, is it all right to start?
Check with Al.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, and Al. bad boys here at last. Last week, the story was about the return from the exile, and paid a special attention to the king called Cyrus the Great. On the list of kings, he is, which you find on page 21 of this new handout, King Cyrus is listed as the second, Cyrus the second. There were two previous kings, but those people were kings before the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon and took over the whole Middle East. This King Cyrus, I would like to point out that that is not the way people said his name. You probably are aware that we often, maybe you're not aware, but you will soon be aware in a few seconds, that we American folks often call people by names that they don't use for themselves at all. For example, we call people Germans. They do not call themselves Germans. They call themselves Deutschlanders. And we call people Greeks, but they do not call themselves Greeks. They call themselves Hellenes. And there are cases like this. The names that we are using are names that were used by the Romans, who were ignorant, or not so much ignorant as they didn't care whether they called people by the right name or not. So, now the man who sent the Jewish people back, the man who was praised so highly, praised himself on that little clay cylinder, but is also praised by, in the prophet Isaiah that we read last week, he was known by the name Kurush. And that came out in the Greek language being spelled with a K, a K-U-R-O-S. Now the Greek language did not have an SH sound, so they couldn't replicate that SH, and so they just wrote K-U-R-O-S. The Romans did not use a K, so they translated it C-Y-R-U-S. And then we pronounce it the way we like to pronounce those letters, which is Cyrus. But in his time, he was called Kurush. I had a friend in New City who went to Hebrew school and knew the Old Testament Hebrew, and he used to call me Kurush. He was the only person in the world that called me that, because he knew that was the real pronunciation of the name. Apparently this word in Aramaic meant the sun, S-U-N, in the sky. So that was what the king was called, Kurush. Now, this king in 539, in the year 539, marched into Babylon. We read about that on the Cyrus cylinder. He says, I came into Babylon with my army, and I set the people free, and then I sent all the prisoners back, so telling them that they could go back home to the places that they came from, including the Jews. The Jews were not alone. He was doing that for anybody and everybody who had been picked on by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. They were all sent back. And he sent them back not only to go back them all the treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from Jerusalem, handed them all back to him. And he told all the other, there's a bunch of papers there, Inge, right by the door, I think there are some extras. He told all the people who lived in the land, if you do not want to go back home, please give a donation to the ones who are, so that they will have resources to resume their lives. And then we read about the Psalm where it talked about they were coming back to the land with rejoicing, and then they were planting their crops, and they were bringing in their harvests, and they were rejoicing. So here's the empire that was created by the Medes and the Persians after they conquered Babylon. And we've already seen from the writings, the ancient writings, that the Persians were at the outset a very much more generous and lenient and pleasant people to be running an empire. They were not the mean and nasty people who cut out people's tongues and poked out their eyes and stole all their stuff. So they were a different breed. On this first page, marked page 21, is a list of all the kings that ruled the Persian Empire, the empire of the what's called the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and Persians were two tribes, both of whom lived in Iran, what we call today Iran, but what in ancient times was called Persia. The Medes lived in the northern part, up near the Caspian Sea, and the Persians lived in the southern part. But after they conquered Babylon, they controlled all of this land that you see on this map on page 21, which starts in India at the Indus River and goes all through the Middle East, through modern Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Judea and Turkey and Egypt, into Egypt. Now, one of the things that you can tell is that Judea, which is located, the letters that spell Judea are entirely too large because Judea didn't occupy all this area. Can you see the Dead Sea? It is a very tiny spot. Well, that Dead Sea is more or less the eastern edge of Judea. And the city of Jerusalem is about 30 miles north and west of the Dead Sea. And that was the heartland and center of the Jewish people, Jerusalem. And so Judea was just a tiny speck in the Middle East, in the Near East. And when you see this vast map that goes all the way from the upper edges of India all the way into Europe, you can see that the Persians had a mighty empire. How do you hold together such mighty empire? Well, they did it primarily by treating people decently. And everybody had, for the most part, a sort of right of self-government as long as they, what would you call it, followed the rules. And what were the rules? Well, the main rules were pay your taxes, and if we need you, send soldiers. And the third rule was don't build any military installations that are intended to help you rebel against the government. So if you be careful not to build your military in a way that looks threatening, if you're willing to send soldiers when you're asked, and if you pay your taxes every year, everybody will get along just handsomely. And that is what actually happened. Now, as you might remember, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and in the end days of the Old Testament, the Jews, the people in Judea, were right in the middle on a track, a path between Egypt and Syria. And the people who were controlling Syria and the Euphrates River Valley were one political unit, and the Egyptians were another. And what the Jewish people had been doing was trying to play these sides against each other all the time. They were trying to figure out who would be the best friend for them to have. And so every now and again, when they didn't like the way they were being treated, they would start going and making negotiations with the other side to see if they could get better arrangements. It's a little bit like being in a country like Poland between Russia and Nazi Germany, or Ukraine between NATO and Russia. You know, there are two sides, and you're a small country in the middle, and you sort of are trying to play for your own survival. And the Jewish people constantly made dumb decisions. They decided to join with the Egyptians and ask the pharaohs to help them just at the time when the pharaohs were not doing very well and were losing. So they had a lot of problems. Now take a look at this map. Egypt, all of Egypt and most of Libya are all part of the Persian Empire. And what that means is there wasn't anybody that the Jewish people could play against the government. The government was located, its headquarters was located at Susa. Can you find Susa? Class, can you find Susa on your map?
Yes.
Point to Susa. Susa is the red star. Now, that was the headquarters of the Persian kings. It's in the far south of Iran, and it's a huge palace complex. And today, the ruins of it still stand, with great walls and the foundations of the king's audience hall, and many sculptures of there are sculptures along the walls of the building that show all these different countries and peoples coming to visit the king, bringing their tax money, their tributes to the king. So Susa was the headquarters, but if the Jewish people didn't like the way the Persians were running this empire, it wouldn't be any use to try to turn to somebody else. There wasn't anybody to turn to. The Egyptians had been swallowed up by the Persians, so there was no two sides that they could play. They were stuck with the Persians, and it can only be said that they were fortunate that the Persians were a rather decent and helpful people. The Persians had expanded their empire all the way to the Aegean Sea, which is in the upper left-hand part of your map. You see the region called Thrace, which is along the Black Sea. They had all this territory, but the part that they did not have was the actual country called Greece. And I don't know if you can, class, can you find Greece on the map?
Yes, teacher.
Oh, good. Yes, it has water all around it, and if you look to the left of that, you can see the bottom of the boot of Italy. And Greece is there, and Greece was a country. What made Greece, quote, a country? I called it a country. But what made Greece Greece? The answer is the Greeks were identified as the people who spoke the Greek language. And actually, there were at least 4 Greek dialects, but they were all the Greek language. And just as, for example, we have English, and we have American English, and we have British English, and we have Australian English, and we have English spoken in India, and it all uses the same vocabulary and the same sentence structures. But you know as well as I do, sometimes it's not all that easy for people in one dialect area to necessarily fully understand the other dialect area. But the Greeks all shared a language, and they all shared a common alphabet, and they had a common culture. They had the same gods, and they had the same culture. What the Greeks never seemed to be able to do was to create a political unity. They were notoriously divisive. And so Greece was comprised of many small city-states, of which the 2 most famous and best known were Athens and Sparta. But there are many others. There was Thebes, and there was Eretria on the island of Euboea, and there were other settlements all along the Turkish coast on the other side of the Aegean, the islands of Samos, Chios, Lesbos, and Rhodes, and all the cities on the mainland of Turkey, which included places like Ephesus and Miletus and Sardis, all these cities that are named in the New Testament, for example, in the book of Revelation and so on. These were all Greek cities, and some of them had already been absorbed into the Persian Empire, the ones that were on the Turkish coast. Now, one of the problems that the Persians were having was that they were developing a kind of hostile relationship with the Greeks. And this hostile relationship lasted for quite a long time, and we know lots about it because an Athenian, he lived in Athens, but he was born in Halicarnassus in Turkey, was named Herodotus. His name is on your paper here, and he is called the father of history. And he is the man who wrote a book about the Persian Wars. And he writes in the first paragraph of his book that the reason he is writing this is to explain how it was that the Greeks came to be at war with the Persian Empire. And he is going to tell the story of how their hostilities developed and how it all turned out. And many parts of this story may be known to some of you, because some parts of it were very famous. The king, whose name is Darius I, he was the third king of the Median Persian Empire. He attempted to attack mainland Greece and take it over. And he went there with an army of 90,000 men, of whom perhaps only 12 or 15,000 were actually Persians. The other people in the army were people that had been called up from all the many places that the Persians ruled. Who knows, there may have even been Jews in that army. But there were 90,000 people under the command of the king. And he wasn't commanding them directly, he had sent them under a general. And their job was to capture Athens and Sparta, and of course all the other little city-states on the mainland of Greece. And they took their ships over there, and they landed the ships on the shore on the north side, north of Athens, about 25 miles, at a very famous place known as Marathon. That was the name of a small Greek town that was 25 miles north of downtown Athens. And this army landed there, and they were unloaded from their ships with infantry and horses and all the paraphernalia of war. And the Athenians sent an armed force to confront them. The Athenians were helped by some Thebans, and the Athenians and the Thebans sent an army that had only about 10,000 men. So they were outnumbered about 9-1. And they fought a ferocious battle. Fortunately, the topography was very helpful to the Greeks. There wasn't enough room to maneuver all those 90,000 people, and they couldn't actually engage them all at once. And the Greeks actually won the battle and broke the ranks of the Persians and drove them into the sea and killed thousands, and the rest of them jumped in their ships and sailed away with their tails between their legs in defeat. This battle was called the Battle of Marathon. It happened in the year 490. What was happening in Jerusalem? They were just going along, celebrating the Passover and enjoying themselves, and paying no attention to all this which was going on far, far away. They didn't even have a cable television at the time. And so they didn't know anything about it. But the Greeks knew about it, and after the battle, the matter was so frightening to the Athenians. They were so sure that their country was going to be overrun and burned and looted, and people would be raped and killed and enslaved. They were scared that this was going to happen. So that after the battle was won, a young man ran all the way from the village of Marathon back to Athens, 26 miles, and he told the people, "We won," and he fell down and died from exhaustion. And his name was Phidippides, and it was because of that run that we have such a thing as a marathon. In any case, the Greeks found themselves at war with the Persian Empire, which was a very scary proposition for them. And they had succeeded in 490. This victory by the Greeks was very annoying to the king Darius. And according to Herodotus, the father of history, Darius the king, every time he had a meal, he had a servant stand up. Instead of saying grace before they ate, the servant would stand up and say, "Sire, remember the Athenians." And he said that every day so that King Darius could remember to get revenge against the Greeks for what they had done. Now Darius died without accomplishing that, so it was his successor who had to launch the next attack against Greece. So these Persians were trying repeatedly. I'll make it brief. The next attack was also unsuccessful and involved heavy losses. The Persians had a lot of ships sunk and a lot of men killed, and they failed to take Greece a second time. So this is why Herodotus wrote this book, because the Greeks were extremely proud of themselves, and they thought that they had succeeded because they had a superior culture. Maybe they did, exceptionalism. They said, well, why should we, a small people, have beaten this mighty empire? And the only answer they could seem to come up with is, well, we're just better than they were. We have special qualities. Now, all this while, practically nothing was coming to Jerusalem. When the people in Jerusalem tried to find the radio or the TV to get the news, they discovered they did not have a radio or a TV, and they had no smartphone, and they remained immensely ignorant about everything that was going on, which was all to the best. Meanwhile, they had other things to do at home. Turn please to page 22. From the writings of Josephus, his history, he wrote a book called Antiquities of the Jews. Flavius Josephus, a few words about him, very important writer for ancient history. He was a Pharisee from Judea. His name was Joseph, in Latin, Josephus. He's known to us as Flavius Josephus because he obtained Roman citizenship during the war that was fought in Judea between the Romans and the Jews in AD 70. And when he obtained Roman citizenship, he moved to Italy, and he was the emperor gave him a very nice country villa to live in retirement. And what he did was he wrote books. And one of the books he wrote was called The Jewish War, in which he explained what had happened in Judea in the years 68, 69, and 70, that's AD. But after he finished that book, some people, Roman people, who read his book, said, well, he said, people kept asking me questions about Judaism and about the country. And he said, so I decided I needed to write another book that told the past history of the Jews going all the way back to Abraham. And so he wrote a book. A big part of it is just copied right out of the Old Testament. But lots of parts of it are not, and the parts that are not have considerable information, like the passage that we're about to read here. This passage comes from Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, and it tells about what was going on in Jerusalem and Judea during the Persian period. Sisinnes, that's the name of a Persian government official, governor of the province beyond the river. That's what the Persians called Syria, the area west to the Euphrates River going over to the Mediterranean, understood the intention of the king. So he assisted the elders of the Jews and the princes of the Sanhedrin. And the building of the temple was, with great diligence, brought to a conclusion, with urging by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, and by the decrees of Kurush and Darius the kings. Now the temple was built in 7 years' time. And in the 9th year of the reign of Darius, which for your convenience I translate 514 BC, the priests and Levites and the populace of the Israelites offered sacrifices, honoring the restoration of prosperity after their captivity, and because they had now the temple rebuilt. The priests and the Levites set the gatekeepers at every gate according to the laws of Moses, and the Jews also built the cloisters of the inner temple that were round about the temple itself. A brief word about this. The temple itself was a single building, but the temple mount included a huge rectangle, and all around the outer edges of that rectangle were buildings with shaded porticos on the inside. All these buildings, I've got this in the footnote, all of these rooms in the porticos, first of all, the porticos were there to give shade to the pilgrims when they came and the festivals, so they didn't have to stand out in the hot sun in the middle of this courtyard. They could stay in the shade under the roofs. But there were rooms there. What were the rooms for? Priests and Levites lived in those rooms who served in the temple. There were storerooms where they kept supplies and food and treasures and donations to the temple, all sorts of things, cleaning equipment. They had a janitor's closet, I'm sure, etc. So those were the porticos all around. And it said the Jews built the cloisters of the inner temple round about the temple. All the people ran together out of the villages to the city and celebrated the festival according to the law of their country. And they offered the sacrifice, which was called the Passover, on the 14th day of the same month, and feasted 7 days, and performed sacrifices of thanksgiving, because God had led them again to the land of their fathers, and had rendered the mind of the kings of Persia favorable to them. In Jerusalem, they made use of a form of government that was aristocratic and oligarchy. You might remember that the monarchy, which was the house and lineage of King David, was destroyed by the Babylonians. And it was not brought back. Instead, the country was now being run by a committee, an aristocratic oligarchy, for the high priests were at the head of their affairs. This is exactly like the way the government of Judea was in the time of Jesus. The Sanhedrin, the high priests, they were the ones who were effectively the local rulers of the Jewish people. Of course, in Jesus' time, the Romans had a governor there, and in the Persian times, there was a Persian governor, but for the most part, they had self-governance with the high priest at the head of the government. Judea, this is what Josephus tells us, Judea at first had kingly government from Saul and David for 532 years. But now they had aristocratic government by a committee of the high priests, which at the top of this page was called the elders of the Jews and princes of the Sanhedrin. Now so you can see here that these institutions were already operating under the Persian Empire, the same as they were later in the time of Jesus.
Where did Josephus get it?
A lot of it from the Bible, but some of it from sources that we don't know. He obviously had lots of resources that we don't know. That's why he's so valuable to us. You know, he's a secondary source, but a knowledgeable one. He was a Pharisee. He was a very learned man, just like Paul the Apostle was, also a Pharisee. Okay, page 23. The Persian Empire eventually ended. So we can skip forward because the rest of the Persian Empire in Judea, things were very boring. They didn't have any bad things going on as far as we know about. But this came to an end with a rather shocking change. This was the conquest by Alexander the Great. Now, what Alexander the Great did was he did something that the Greek people had never been able to do. He unified all the Greeks under his own control. It was his father, King Philip of Macedonia, who by force of arms compelled all the Greeks to come together under his leadership. They were very upset about it and annoyed and disgusted, and they would have happily not had it happen, but they got whipped several times by the Macedonians, and they fell under the control of the king of Macedonia. The king of Macedonia, he however aspired to excel. He was ambitious for his own son, Alexander. He wanted his son to be better educated and more sophisticated than he was himself. He was kind of a rural man, a kind of just a rural guy, you know, like to ride horses and go out hunting and rouse the bow. But he wanted his son to be a smarter and better person than he. So he hired a tutor, Aristotle, and he brought him to the capital and gave him a beautiful place to live and a big story, and Aristotle was Alexander's tutor for several years. And he taught him about the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Alexander loved the Iliad so much that during his entire career, he used to keep a copy of the Iliad under his pillow in his suite. Anyway, Alexander decided that one way to keep the Greeks from being obnoxious and fussy, which was their nature, he would give them something to do that would take their minds off of troublemaking. And his plan was to attack the Persian Empire. Now this probably would have been looked upon by most people as a really pathetic idea. I mean, it is true that the Greeks, outnumbered massively, had twice beaten the Persians away from their country. But the prospect of a little tiny country, which you can see right here how little teeny tiny it is, conquering this big yellow blob all over the Middle East is very, very low. But Alexander called all the Greeks together and he said, bring your troops, send your people, we're going over the Hellespont, we're gonna land over on the Asia side, and we are going to attack the Persian Empire. And I don't know, I guess there were some people who might have snickered a lot about this. But in fact, the Greeks sent their troops, they took them across the river, and he started out with a rather humble military, probably about 30,000 men. And of course, as soon as he got across the river, across the Hellespont, and landed in Asiatic Turkey, as we would call it, the local Persian governors marshaled a military force and brought it against him. And it was probably 3 times as many people as Alexander had. And they met, the two armies, at a place called the Granicus River. And the Greeks were on the west side of the river and the Persians on the east side of the river. And the Macedonians and Greeks, at the command of Alexander, charged into the river and surged onto the east side and attacked. And Alexander himself, who was 19 years old, he led the charge. He was on his horse, Bucephalus, and he was right at the front. And he was the first man up the embankment and right smack into the face of the enemy. And this was a characteristic of his in all the battles. He used to drive some of the men who were supposed to be his bodyguards crazy by going into the heaviest part of battle at the front. And it was just the way he operated. And of course, one of the results was that his men had almost unbreakable admiration for him. And of course, he had his copy of the Iliad. And lo and behold, in that first battle, they smashed the Persian force, broke it apart, the Persians fled. In ancient battles, it was almost always the same. It was very similar to what happened in the American Civil War. 2 sides would come and clash together, and the first side that sort of broke and ran would turn into a panic. And the other side would pursue, and the running away force would get cut to ribbons from behind and scattered and broken, and the defeat would just get more awful the more hours went by, you know, and in 2 hours' time, the one army would be just scattered all over the place and gone, and many men dead, and so on. Well, the Battle of Granicus was a complete success for Alexander, and that was the beginning of his great crusade. If you turn to page 26 for a moment, you will see that there is another map there. And on this map, the one that has a tan near east, you will notice that the tan part looks almost exactly like the yellow map that we just looked at, with one exception. Greece and Macedonia are now part of it as well. And what is the red line full of arrows? This red line is the path taken by Alexander and his troops in their 12-year crusade, which completely dominated and conquered the Persian Empire. And it started in the capital city of Pella, and it went across, and can you see the cross swords there, the teeny tiny cross swords where it says Granicus? That was the first battle. And then you follow, and there he zigzagged through the country. And what happened when he was going through the country with his troops? All the cities, you can guess, all the cities greeted him and threw up their hands and say, "Hail, hail, the winner, you know." And they all just ditched the Persians just like that and joined up. And he just went right on through. And finally he came to northern Syria, to a place called Issus. And this is shown on the map there with crossed swords to show you that this was the site of the second major battle. Now, if you'll turn, please, to page 23 again, here is a description of the Battle of Issus, written by a Roman historian some years later. This is a battle that was fought in the year 333. Alexander moved his forces to Issus. Parmenio, that's one of his older advisors, who was a member of his father's court, suggested that no place would be more suitable for a battle. The engaged forces of each side would be equal in numbers because the narrow space would not allow a longer front line. Alexander concurred, and the two armies engaged. And once again, Alexander was on the left flank and at the head of the cavalry and led a charge. Then truly there was great bloodshed. The two armies closed till shield struck shield, and sword points were directed into foes' faces. Foot to foot they fought, holding ground until they could make space to advance by striking down the enemy. The wounded could not pull out of the line, since the enemy pressed in front and their own men from behind. Alexander acquitted himself like any soldier. He sought the glory of slaying the king. Darius was standing high in his chariot. His men strove to protect him, the enemy to attack. Around him were heaps of horsemen and infantry. Macedonians also fell there, valiant men, but not many. Alexander himself was slightly wounded in the right thigh by a sword cut. The horses of Darius' chariot were frantic with pain tossing their harness and shaking the king. Fearing that he'd be captured, Darius cast off his royal gear, leaped upon a horse to make his getaway. The rest of the Persians then scattered in fear and flight, casting away their arms. So Alexander won another battle. Next page, a different historian describing parts of this battle. At the top of this page, you see a very, very famous mosaic, which is a depiction of the Battle of Issus. And this particular mosaic is enormous. It's about 12 feet long and about 8 feet tall, and it fills a whole wall in the museum at Naples, the Archaeological Museum. And it is based upon an ancient Greek oil painting that was made not long after the battle itself. And you can see in this painting King Darius standing in his chariot, leaning it, reaching his hand out, and over on the far left, some of the mosaic is badly damaged, but you can see Alexander over on the left, just to the left of that stumpy tree, and he's charging toward Darius, and in between are people, horses and men, falling to the ground everywhere. King Darius was conveyed safely in his chariot as long as he rode on level ground in his flight, but when he came upon ravines and rough ground, he abandoned the chariot, casting off his shield and cloak. He even left his bow in the chariot, and mounting a horse, continued his flight. The night, which came on soon after, darkness rescued him from being captured by Alexander. The camp of Darius was taken. In it were captured his mother, his wife, and his infant son. In the camp, no more than 3,000 talents were captured. But soon after, more money in Damascus was seized by Parmenio. Such was the result of this famous battle, fought when Nicostratus was Archon of the Athenians. So this battle was the terminal battle that broke the Persian Empire. Page 25. At the top of this is a portrait of Alexander, a sculpture, and at the bottom is a detail from that mosaic where you can see Alexander himself with a lance in his hand, charging to the front towards the king. After this, Alexander became the ruler of the whole Persian Empire. It took 12 years for him and his men to traverse the entire empire. They went all the way to the Indus River in northern India before they turned back and returned to Babylon. They came back to Babylon, and he decided to settle in Babylon as king of the entire empire. That was going to be his headquarters. And lo and behold, within a few months, he fell ill and died at the age of 33. So he had completely changed the political scene. What about the Jewish people? Well, they just flipped right over into being part of Alexander's empire like everybody else. Now, I have no idea. It's even possible that there were Jewish soldiers in the armed force that fought at Issus, because we don't have a detailed account of all the different places that sent their troops to support the king. So, when Alexander died, suddenly his empire politically fell apart. Page 26 explains this. It says, Alexander's empire was immediately torn apart. At first, all of his officers held a big meeting in Babylon. And at that meeting, they sat there with maps and they determined which of them was going to be in charge of which area. The final decision that resulted was the map that you see on page, at the bottom of page 26. The home country, which was Greece and Macedonia, which you see here in a sort of rose color, its capital at Pella, was given to one of the officers named Antigonus, and that is also where Alexander's mother, Olympias, lived. And she, by the way, was very influential after his death. So that was one of the kingdoms. Now that kingdom looks quite small, but it was also, in some ways, a very important kingdom because it was the homeland of the original Greek people. The country of Egypt was given to a bodyguard whose name was Ptolemy, which is a dialect word in Greek meaning warrior. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's personal bodyguard, which was a group of elite troops that were supposed to take care of him, which they had a hard time doing since he kept running to the front of the battle all the time. Anyway, Ptolemy took over Egypt. That was by agreement. The Asian part of the country was delivered to another officer named Seleucus, and he made his headquarters at Antioch in Syria, which is very curious because it means he did not occupy Susa, which had been the capital of the Persians. He did not occupy Babylon, which had been the capital of Nebuchadnezzar, and also the place where Alexander thought he might be the king of the empire. He moved eastward into Syria to the city of Antioch, and that remained the headquarters of a dynasty that descended from this man named Seleucus. And so, and the country of Egypt immediately fell into the control of this man Ptolemy the First, whose name was, every one of the Ptolemies had, we'll talk about this next week, had a throne name, and his throne name was Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. And he was very, these men were very suspicious of one another, and none of them were friendly to one another. So each of these kingdoms developed into a separate entity, and they were not reunited. So the empire broke in pieces, and what you got was the beginning of a period of history that's known to historians as the Hellenistic period. That is to say, the period of history where Greek and Macedonian soldiers and government officials were the people who ruled in every place. King Ptolemy made his capital in a brand new city, which we'll talk about next week, called Alexandria, which had just been built. It was a brand new city. And one of the things he did to, this might remind you of the way the Russians behaved. One of the things that he did was this. Alexander's body was loaded onto wagons with some soldiers and was being transported from Babylon all the way back west to go back to Pella, the capital of Macedonia, to be buried in the same tombs with his father, King Philip, the family tombs. Ptolemy sent a military force and they ambushed the procession in northern Syria and they stole Alexander's body. And they took it to Alexandria, Egypt. And they built a huge monument right smack in the center of town where two big highways crossed. And they put Alexander's coffin inside a glass case for everybody to see. And it was like, you know, Lenin's tomb in Moscow. It was a symbol that Ptolemy was the real successor. The Ptolemies turned out to be a very successful dynasty that ruled in Egypt. Every single king, there were 9 of them. Every single king was named. I can recite their names, I'm very good at it. Ptolemy first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third, Ptolemy the fourth, Ptolemy the fifth, Ptolemy the sixth, Ptolemy the seventh, Ptolemy the eighth, Ptolemy the ninth. And then, the last ruler of that dynasty, it will surprise you,
Yes.
Cleopatra. She was the final ruler of that family. And she ended up being conquered by the Romans and committing suicide. And that was the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Now, if you look at the top of the page, page 26, you will see it says, the Ptolemies were in Egypt, and the Jews were part of their empire. And you can see this at the bottom. The green empire, the green kingdom, the Egyptian kingdom, includes the North Sinai and Judea and part of Syria. So they were in the Ptolemaic zone. And I should say that from 331, the death of Alexander, until 146, the Jews were in the under the influence of Ptolemaic Egypt, and they were vassals of the Egyptian kings. And it was a time of general peace and goodwill, and the relationships were very positive. It was a very good time. Then there was a huge battle, and they fell under the control of the Seleucid kings, who defeated an Egyptian army on the Golan Heights. By the way, that's where the battle was fought, a very large battle, and the Egyptians were defeated, and they lost control of Judea, and it fell into the hands of the Seleucids. And from 46 to 60 BC, the Seleucids were the people in charge of the Jews in Jerusalem. And it was a very bad time. The Jewish people had a very, very negative experience with the Seleucid kings. And there was persecution and war and rebellion and endless trouble. And so they went through a good period, and then they went through a bad period. Next week, we will look at the good period